But during the middle of the 18th century, there was a return, an aliyah to Eretz Yisrael. Firstly by the Talmidim of the Gra of Vilna, and then other rabbis came and they settled and they bought plots of land, and they realized that in order to survive, they had to not only depend on contributions from abroad, the so-called kololim, from Hungary, from Germany, etc., etc., but they had to develop their own sources of their own resources. And the basic resource which was available to them was land. So they bought plots of land and they began agricultural activities at various times. And then, of course, there was the problem of the sabbatical year. And the sabbatical year became a major issue because to close down all their agricultural activities for a whole year would have meant basically that the whole of the yishuv, the whole of the resettlement process would have collapsed economically. So beginning in the middle 18th century, various rabbis sought different types of solutions. And the solution that was refined in the most detailed fashion was that of Rav Kook Zatzal, the first chief rabbi of Eretz Yisrael during the mandatory period in the early days of the 20th century. And he developed what had already been begun earlier on by earlier rabbis, a whole system whereby the arable land of Eretz Yisrael was sold to a non-Jew, basing himself on an opinion in the Talmud that the laws, the agricultural laws applying to Eretz Yisrael, that means tithes, tumot, maasot, and shvit, the sabbatical year, do not apply when the land does not belong to a Jew. The technical term is yesh kinyan la'akum lahafkiya midei chiyuv shmita. A non-Jew, a Gentile, has the ability to own, by owning land, to remove the obligation of the laws, the agricultural laws in Eretz Yisrael. Now, you have to understand the degree to which this was a remarkably revolutionary idea. Rav Kook was an ardent Zionist. He was perhaps one of the fathers of Orthodox Zionism, he and Rav Kalischer. And for him to say that we should sell the land of Israel, the arable land of Israel, to a non-Jew is something that would appear to be completely contradictory to his basic beliefs. But he felt that the survival of the Jewish community in Eretz Yisrael, the Yishuv, was of such importance that he was willing to suggest selling the land for 1 year to non-Jews in order to avoid the strictures of the sabbatical year, permit the people who are living on the land to continue their agricultural activities, and therefore continue to assure the continued survival of the newly developing Yishuv in Eretz Yisrael. Obviously, there was antagonism to his views, and one of the great contemporary rabbis, the Ridvaz, came out against this, and there were arguments and counter-arguments. But this became the means whereby the Israeli rabbinate consistently, in the following years and after the establishment of the state, used this particular means, which is called the heter mechira, the heter based on selling the land, in order to avoid the problems, the economic problems which the sabbatical year presents. So you can imagine in modern-day Israel, if you can't grow oranges and you can't sell your flowers and etc., etc., I mean, a great deal of our economy is based on exporting fruit and vegetables in seasons where it's not available in other countries. And once you can't stop for a year because other markets will just take over. And for the first time in the last sabbatical year, the Haredi establishment, which was run by the Mo'etzat Gedolei HaTorah, which at that time was Rav Shach and Rabbi Yoshev, Zichronam Livracha, decided that what was good for Rav Kook is not good for us. We can't sell the land, you have to keep Shemitah. What it's going to do to the economy of the country doesn't bother us. We'll get money from Chutz La'aretz. You people are going to pay for us. You'll give us donations. We'll survive. For the first time, the Rabbanut didn't carry out, this was done by the Rabbanut, actually by the Ministry of Religion and the Ministry of the Interior. But the political parties in Israel, Agudat Yisrael, Degel, etc., were so powerful since they have, the casting vote in our complex coalition government structure, that the Rabbanut was not able to do it. There was an uproar, and finally a solution was found that the Rabbanut wouldn't do it, but the Rav of Tnuva would do it. Well, Tnuva is a big agricultural monopoly, so they did it and they solved it. Many of the Rabbanei Ha'arim, many of the rabbis of the chief rabbis of the different cities didn't accept it, and therefore they weren't willing to give hechsherim to the restaurants, to the shops, etc., that based themselves on the heter mechira. So you can see that there was a complete shift, a shift where they, instead of accepting the ruling of one of the great authorities that had been functioning for almost 100 years, they rejected it because they knew better. Because they still saw this as an innovation which is Chadash Asur Min HaTorah. Rav Kook, Zatzal, in his various writings, sought to counteract this whole movement which basically leads to a calcification or a petrification of halakha. If you can't innovate, if you can't make changes, if whenever you have a problem you always say asur and not mutar, then you really can't function as a society. So he coined a beautiful phrase. And the phrase was, and I'll say it in Hebrew and translate it, Hayashan yitchadesh v'hachadash yitkadesh. That which is old will be renewed, will be revivified, and the new, the innovative, will be sanctified. Now, this was the exact diametric opposite to Chadash Asur Min HaTorah. He went further and he made a very important halachic statement. He said as follows, and again I quote in Hebrew and I'll translate, because the formulation is so succinct. He said, Ein isur lahatir et hamutar, af al pi shelo nahagu kein be'avar. There is no prohibition to permit that which is permitted, even if it was not practiced in the past. There was a view that things which were not practiced in the past, became, as it were, a minhag, a custom, and therefore achieved a certain degree of authority, of sanctity. He said no. The fact that it wasn't done for historical or social reasons, if you can't find a reason that it should be prohibited, it's not prohibited.